Well, I think we ought to do some voting. So, which brother do you think was more well-rounded and in touch with the world and had a sense of humility and who was generous in everything from that point on? Would your vote go to the younger brother or the older brother? If you were moving into their neighborhood and wanted a best friend to hang out with, would you tend toward the younger brother or toward the older brother? If you were going to pick the next mayor, the younger brother or the older brother? The next head of an organization, younger or older? Your next pastor, don't worry, I'm not making any announcements, younger brother or older brother? Why? If you had an answer to each of those, what is it that draws you to one or the other? The story of the prodigal son that Gail read this morning is so familiar to many of us. Anyone who has grown up in a church has heard 101 different sermons, and so many related to this text. Some sermons boil it down to the generosity of God. Some boil it down to how we can be forgiven for anything. Some, depending on your tradition, boil it down to how much we are squandering and the need for repentance and going home to God. You get the idea. Sometimes a preacher will choose one character and focus on that character. Sometimes the younger son who took his inheritance and went and blew it on wild living, or the father who was so betrayed by the younger son who chose forgiveness and joy, or the older son who was self-righteous and unable to join in the homecoming celebration because of resentment. Every once in a while, you might hear a sermon that focuses entirely on the feast and not at all on any of the characters. I'm going to preach that one someday. I haven't preached it yet. But sometimes, like today, it's fun to take a theme and see how the story illustrates the theme. So, at the heart of this story is such a real contrast between one child who excels in making mistakes and failing at life, and the other child who does everything right, seems to be almost perfect, and yet still appears to be failing at life because of a complete and total lack of joy. We see played out before us failure and perfection. And honestly, in this story, neither one looks appealing, but there are some things we might be able to glean from trying to understand each one. Now remember, this is not a slice of history. This is fiction. This is a made-up story to invite some deeper thinking and understanding. Jesus told this story in a series of stories about how important it is to look for and to seek the lost. Jesus told the stories after the Pharisees and scribes had accused him of eating with tax collectors and sinners. Scholars who have studied the parables often say that in every parable there is at least one twist or surprise. In this parable, there is more than just one. If you're anything like me, though, you get to this story and you want the backstory. What on earth prompted the younger son to ask for his inheritance and then take off to live in another country. That didn't just come out of the blue. What prompted it? Was he jilted by someone he loved? Was he tired of being the younger brother? Did he know that his older brother would inherit all of the land and the home in which they were living? Was he simply in search of himself? And then the other part of the story that we often skip over related to the younger brother is that you have to admit his timing is terrible. He goes off for his adventure and the famine comes. If the famine had not come to the land, it's possible he could have stretched his adventure on and on. But when famine comes, there is no work and there is no food. What finally seemed to get to him was his hunger. He was starving. And because he was working for someone else, his job was feeding the pigs, but no one was giving him any food. He realized one day that if he went home, there was a chance that his father would at least hire him as a field hand, and then he would be given food to eat. Hunger was the driver, and he fully expected to be treated at most like a hired hand. He's so comfortable now with failure that he's willing to continue to live as a hired hand in his own family. And what was the backstory for the older son? Why has he been working, and the word there is servant or slave, why has he been working like a slave or a servant for his father? Why has he never disobeyed his father's instruction? That does not bode well for him or his father. Was his father so harsh that he was afraid to disobey? Was he steeped in what an oldest son was obligated to do? Was he actually trying to earn his inheritance? It is a child's responsibility in their development to disobey their parents. So why didn't he? Was he just a natural-born rule follower? Or was he just someone who wanted things to be done in a certain way, no matter how good someone else's intentions might be? What drove him to his perfectionism? What I find most dissatisfying about the story of these two sons is that we never get to resolution. We never get to hear that the younger son realized how foolish he had been and was genuinely sorry and then able to learn from his mistakes. We never get to hear that the older brother realized how generous his father had been all along and would continue to be to him. We never hear from the older brother any agreement or understanding of what the father has told him about the reality of their life together. The father said to the older son, "Everything I have is yours." And we never get to hear the recognition of that truth by the older brother. No resolution. Apparently, we have to come up with our own. So annoying. As we explore our theme of good enough and trying to give up perfection, most of us who have ever struggled with perfectionism will attest to how difficult it can be. What's interesting about listening to people share their own struggles is how many different reasons there are for perfectionism. For some, it's about old messages from family or church about how you are supposed to be. For others, it is all about pleasing people. For others, it's really centered in control. For others, it's about following rules. For others, it's about believing deeply in reward and punishment based on behavior. Whatever the motivations, it is not something that is easy to change, and it is not going to be changed overnight. In her book titled The Gifts of Imperfection, Brené Brown has said that you cannot separate perfectionism from shame. Meaning, if you get to the heart of someone's perfectionism, you will encounter shame somewhere along the way. Well, I realize this is probably not a surprise to any of you, but I too am a recovering perfectionist. And my particular strand was about the alcoholism in my family and thinking that if I could just do everything right, my mom would be happier and not want to drink. My older siblings were all out sowing their wild oats. And the fundamentalist church I was a part of ingrained in me that the spiritual path was all about not sinning. In other words, being perfect. It was a double whammy for me, those two things. And I'm grateful to say I have made tremendous progress in my recovering from wanting everything to be perfect, including me. And let's face it, therapy really does help. When the older brother is unable to celebrate the return of his younger brother, we get a glimpse into how lost he has been. Even though the story is told as though the younger brother is the one who is lost. The older brother is living a life of obligation, and he has been lacking in joy all along. Perfectionism has a way of robbing people of joy. It is impossible to please other people all the time, so the stress of that is real. It is impossible to be perfect, so keeping up the illusion is excruciating. There is very little learning about oneself or one's life when perfection is the goal. So the emotional and spiritual depth of perfectionists are deeply impacted. I have this image of perfectionists often living with a kind of shell around them. And at some point, that shell is shattered. And when it is, there's an invitation to learn something about it. And sometimes there's refusal. And then that shell just gets reconstructed a little bit thicker. Just because perfectionism robs us of joy and learning and even depth doesn't mean that failure is the opposite. I am all in favor of failure as a tool for learning. Anyone who has ever raised a child has to be in favor of failure. But I also know that just because we throw ourselves into a life that goes against what is best for us doesn't mean that we will learn from it. The younger brother in our story fails spectacularly and with abandon. He has to know he has just taken all of the money he will ever get. He knows he's left home and traveled to a place where no one knows him, no one cares about him, and no one feels any loyalty toward him. He knows he is seeking pleasure above all else. Of course, he doesn't know the famine is coming. But when you spend money that recklessly, you usually have a sense that at some point you're going to run out. But denial is strong, and it's possible he didn't take any of the above into consideration. When he finally realizes he is starving, he makes the decision to go home where there is food. And he rehearses ahead of time what he's going to say. So in his mind, he's thinking, I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands. Well, in the story, when his father sees him a long way off, his father runs out to greet him. And when he sees his father, the younger son says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. And he stops there. And the father then gives all the commands for a party. Now, it's not clear if the father interrupted him or if he stopped short, hoping for something a little better than what he had originally envisioned. We cannot tell if the younger brother learned anything from his mistakes and his colossal failure. So when I say I am all in favor of failure and making mistakes, what I mean by that is that making mistakes is necessary for our health and our growth, but making mistakes does not ensure health or growth, especially if we hold ourselves to such a standard that we can barely admit said mistakes. And if we admit them, does that mean we learn from them? Not necessarily. If we allow ourselves to make mistakes, that is at least the soil from which learning can seed and sprout. If we choose perfectionism, we don't even have any soil. Well, we haven't said much about the father yet, and that's because I am never quite sure what to say about the father. I vacillate between wanting to affirm him for his generosity and wanting to sit him down and have a talk about parenting that involves accountability and codependency. I relate to his running full speed to his son when he saw him from far away. I can't even imagine the angst of a parent whose child willingly disappears, and you begin to think they're dead, and then you have the unimaginable joy of seeing them alive. I literally can't fathom that. I have also known many parents who would have been so done at that point that they never would have been looking off in the distance anyway. The father is the embodiment of joy in this story, and for that reason, we should all be a little more curious about how he got there. Clearly, his material wealth was not his God. clearly his capacity for forgiveness is larger than life. All I can think is that he must have had some spiritual grounding and connection that gave him the strength and wisdom and joy he had. What I wish we could know is whether his compassion and love and generosity and joy and grounding made an impact forever on the sons. Did the younger son learn from his mistakes and yearn to be more like his father? Did the older son recognize his life of obligation and resentment? And did he ultimately choose freedom and joy? Well, let's bring it a little closer to home. What about you? How have you been like the younger son and made your share of mistakes or even failed? What happened as a result of your mistakes or failure? Did you just rush on to the next thing? Or did you take some time to learn from the experience? Are there any mistakes or failures in your life that you still want to be able to learn from? Are there unresolved mistakes or failures that you still want to make right? Maybe you are more like the older brother than the younger. How might you be living a life of obligation these days? How are you feeling resentment from a lack of choice or freedom? How deep is your anger over wealth that is not coming your way that you think you deserve? How jealous are you of what someone else is receiving that you are not? How are you currently insisting that things be done your way? The middle ground between perfectionism and failure is a life that is good enough. A life that is good enough in relationship to failure is one in which mistakes are made, failure happens, and we learn from and we change our behavior as a result. We make amends when we hurt people, and we intentionally try to create new habits. A life that is good enough in relationship to perfectionism is one in which we catch ourselves when we think in terms of perfection, or when we insist on control, or when we feel anxious about all that could go wrong, or when we think we have to do everything or it just isn't going to be good enough. We catch ourselves in that stinking thinking, as we mentioned last Sunday, and then we invite ourselves into a different way of thinking. Jesus told some stories to illustrate to the perfectionists in his life why he hung out with and ate with people who were failures in their eyes. But the irony, one of the twists that we were talking about earlier, is that Jesus was really talking about those people and those things who were lost And if they had been listening carefully, the perfectionists would have heard in the story that they are also lost, just like the older brother who never went anywhere. And if they were listening carefully, the ones who were called out for being sinners and tax collectors would have also heard that they were lost, just like the younger brother who went home to be found. So whether you lean a little more toward perfectionism or a little more toward failure, we are all lost, and we are all found at the same time. Will we learn from this story? Will we learn from our lives that if we come to our senses and we are willing to turn ourselves around and go home to God, that we too will be the recipients of such incredible love and generosity and joy? Amen.